Oh, good day everyone. My name's Scott Williams and I'm a vet by training and I did a Masters in Agricultural Animal Medicine and Production. But it's quite a while since I've been a practicing vet, so I'll just sort of give you that caveat. I may be a little rusty on the details of some of the diseases nowadays, but I work more at the industry level, mainly in the sheep industry, also in the red meat industry a little bit. So I work a lot with companies like Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, Dairy Australia, those sorts of companies. And I'm also involved in emergency animal disease responses. So I'm part of what's called the Consultative Committee on Emergency Animal Disease. If we had foot and mouth disease, for example, I'd be one of the people that the wool industry would put onto their technical committee to advise on how that was handled. So I just wanted to give you that background, so just to say that, you know, I'm not a practicing vet. I don't want you to rely too much on my specific advice about a specific disease, but what I'm hoping to give you an idea about tonight is just the whole sort of emergency animal disease area, what would happen in the case of something like foot and mouth disease or lumpy skin that we've talked about. There's a few others as well. But also to talk to you about on-farm biosecurity and what you can do. We've had a good introduction to that, Alan. Thank you for raising that issue, because there's a very good example of on-farm biosecurity. So is everyone comfortable with that? We'll get started. Please feel free to just interrupt at any stage and ask a question. You know, grab the microphone. Maybe tell me your name when you open up. With a crowd this size, I can probably even remember the names. We'll see how we go. The country. So the objectives for tonight are really to understand why biosecurity is important in any farming enterprise. It sounds to me as though you guys have that covered already, you understand that. But we will talk a bit about it. To learn about the major diseases of concern at the moment, particularly the exotic diseases that we're worried about. And as I said, finally to find out about good biosecurity practices, how to plan and how to implement good biosecurity on your farm. Again, I suspect we're preaching to the converted a little bit tonight, which is a shame. It is a shame, isn't it, that you run a workshop on biosecurity and you get so few people, and yet it's such an important topic. And I've run workshops on biosecurity before around Victoria where we have struggled to get 3-4 people in a room. They come out of it saying that was really useful, really interesting, but getting them in the room in the first place is really hard. So that's a shame, but we've got a good little group here. All right, so firstly, I just wanted to go through a few definitions, just so you know what I'm talking about with a couple of these acronyms and so on. So firstly, biosecurity is broadly the management of risks to the economy, the environment and the community of pests and disease entering, emerging, establishing or spreading. So it's actually a pretty broad concept. It's not just about keeping disease out. It's also about, if the disease does get in, then detecting it, managing it, eradicating it, if you need to, or controlling it. All those sorts of aspects come into our definition of biosecurity. So it's fairly broad. A couple of important acronyms: emergency animal and emergency plant diseases. So you'll hear us talk, and I think Rihanna mentioned this, EADs, emergency animal diseases. So they're things like foot and mouth, they're things like lumpy skin disease, they're things like Japanese encephalitis, which you would have heard of. They're not necessarily all exotic, and they're the next two definitions we've got. So an exotic disease is one that doesn't currently exist. Now, whether that's on your farm or in the state, it's usually applied to the country. So an exotic disease is one that we don't have in Australia, usually. And then we have endemic diseases, which are ones that are already present. And some EADs are endemic. So anthrax, for example, is an emergency animal disease. It's treated like an emergency, even though it's endemic and it's been here, you know, for a couple of centuries probably. So I just want to get those definitions clear before we go on, just so I'm not causing any confusion as we go along. All right, so why is biosecurity important? First thing to say is, and I've sort of alluded to this, it operates at multiple levels. Right, so we talk about biosecurity at the national level, and that's where we talk about things like foot and mouth disease, lumpy skin disease, Varroa Mite, which you might have heard of in bees. There's something called the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement that the states and territories and the Commonwealth Government and all of the livestock industries sign up to. And that's an agreement around cost sharing. I'll talk a bit more about this as we go on, but This is an agreement as to how we would respond to an emergency animal disease and who pays for it, essentially. And it's got a schedule attached to it which has about 60 diseases on it. So it just gives you a sense of the number of diseases that are out there that are significant enough that they're included in that EADRA. And then there's new ones emerging all the time. And they're across a range of species. Okay, so sheep and cattle, which I will talk mostly about. I apologise, that's my background. But, you know, chickens, pigs, horses, all species. We talk about biosecurity at the state level as well, because there are certain things we don't have here that that do exist in other states. So one that I've come across, for example, is tomato potato psyllid, which has been found in WA, but hasn't been found in the eastern states yet. And that can carry a bacterium that causes something called zebra chip in potatoes. So you get this sort of black and white banding, which is, as you can imagine, is not good for the sale of the potatoes. It's a big disease in California, it's been in New Zealand, it hasn't yet been in Australia, but we do have the insect, which is the psyllid. And I've got fruit fly up there, but of course we have fruit fly in Victoria, don't we? We didn't traditionally have it, but it's becoming more of a problem. And then at the farm level, we've got diseases like sheep lice, foot rot in sheep, multiple resistant worms, so we can regard that as a specific condition. So worms that are resistant to a whole lot of different drenches that you may, you know, those worms you mightn't already have on your property. Herbicide-resistant weeds, and weeds in general, of course. And I'm sorry, I sometimes forget to mention weeds because I've got an animal background, but they're just as important.
Scott, just before you jump to the next slide, is there a listing you can provide us for the national diseases? I mean, you mentioned the 3 or 4 of them there, but
Yep.
I think you said there are about 60 of them.
Yes.
Is there any way we can get hold of this? I'm interested in pink eye.
Yeah, well, no, pink eye's not there because that's around emergency diseases. So they're exotic diseases plus a few ones like anthrax that are in the emergency animal disease response agreement. But pink eye doesn't make it to that level. No, so it's considered an endemic disease that is significant in some particular areas and on some farms, but it's not an emergency disease. Okay. I could tell you where to find those 60 diseases if you're interested, yeah, but it's something called the EADRA, the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement. It's on the Animal Health Australia website.
Give me some links or...
Yep.
We can send out, if there are resources that we want to send out at the end, I'm guessing there'll be a list by the end of tonight. We can get that sent out to everyone that registered.
Yes, please, that would be very good.
And I'm happy to give you a copy of this presentation too if it's useful, because there's quite a few links in it that you might find useful. Yeah. So I thought I'd talk a bit about the exotic diseases of current concern, because the number of these are ones you will have heard about, and you're maybe not sure what they involve. Foot and mouth's had a lot of airtime, lumpy skin's had a lot of airtime, I realise that, but I just thought it might be worth talking a little bit about them, what they look like, you know, that sort of thing. So FMD, lumpy skin disease, African swine fever is another one. We don't have any pig producers, unfortunately, so that won't be of great interest, but that's a disease that's caused absolute carnage in China, for example, over the last few years, kills a lot of pigs. Japanese encephalitis virus, which we had in last year, I think, wasn't it, 2022? And Varroa Mite, which I mentioned before. So I just thought I'd talk about those as a sort of a sample of the diseases that are at the top of the list at the moment for people. So foot and mouth disease, as I'm sure you know, it affects cloven-hoofed animals. So it affects, sheep, cattle, pigs. It affects deer. Also affects camelids. It's a really contagious viral disease. So this is the rock star of exotic diseases when you're a vet. It spreads super fast and by just about any means. You know, it'll blow on wind. It'll be present just in the environment, on objects, it's passed between animals. So it's a highly contagious disease. It causes fever, mouth and foot blisters, of course, which is the characteristic sign of foot and mouth disease. And you can see a picture there. That's not working. No, that's not working. Anyway, you can see that tongue there, particularly in that bottom picture, and that oral mucosa just inside the bottom lip. Really bad sort of sloughing and ulcers. And then this, of course, causes a reluctance to eat. If it's around the feet, a reluctance to walk. Animals lose weight. If they're dairy cattle, they go off their milk, just about completely off their milk. It does cause deaths as well, but it's not a highly fatal disease. That's not the concern. It's about the production loss and the fact that no other country wants it. So that's why it's of such impact to us. It's quite silent in sheep, and that's worth noticing because it means that if our early infection is in sheep flocks, it might be a while before it's picked up because you don't really notice it that much. You might just see a little bit of lameness. You might have to look carefully and see lesions around their feet. But they'll be spreading that virus even though we don't necessarily know it's there. Cattle, it's much more visible, much more noticeable.
Can I just make a comment on those two bottom slides? One, the tongue with the ruptured blister.
Yes.
And the mucosa. That's mid-stage disease. That's not start disease.
No, it's
that's
not.
That's mid-stage and getting to almost to the end stage. So those animals there will have been shedding for a considerable period of time.
Yes, you're quite right.
So when you actually first see your animal with a cow or usually cow, with lameness, you'll see blisters rather than burst blisters. So that's later on in the disease, and you'll get it on around the teats and around the coronary bands of the feet.
Yep.
And so, for we people who live fairly close to Tullamarine, we're probably in the firing line. Have a look at your animals if they're not walking around normally.
Yes.
And make sure that if you see a blister in there, faint and then ring the DVO if you can find one.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. You've just stolen about 3 of my slides, but I appreciate that.
That's all right. I'll probably steal a few more before the day's over.
No, that's very good. I mean, and that's going to be one of the main messages from today. If in doubt, call a vet. And if you don't want to call your private vet, call one of the department vets, get them to come out and have a look. There's an exotic disease hotline that you can ring, and people will respond very quickly to that.
Is it 7 days a week or 5?
It's 7 days a week, 24 hours. Yep. In fact, I was talking to Rihanna about it earlier on. She was talking about how she did a foot and mouth exclusion on Christmas Eve 1 year, and she drove it down to Geelong, down to the lab down there straight away. That's what they do, and within 6 hours they had a response. They suspected it was something else because there'd been another disease present in that herd that causes the sort of vesicles that you were talking about. But they had to rule it out, and that's what they did, yeah. So 24/7. So foot and mouth disease, it seems to be, you would get the impression from the media that this threat has died off, over the last few months. It was headlines, people were really worried about it, people were running around like crazy. They're still running around like crazy, but if you listen to the media, it sounds as though it's all abated, but that's not the case. It's present in Sumatra, Java, Bali at the moment, other parts of Indonesia. It's really pretty close to our doorstep, and it certainly hasn't gone away. So this, it continues to be the issue, the disease we're most nervous about. Now, why are we nervous? Because this is what it's likely to cost if it ever comes in. So if you look at the bottom line figure there, there's an estimate there from 2013. There's an estimate in the right-hand column, was updated for 2022. And the total direct cost is estimated to be around $72 billion should foot and mouth disease get in. And you can see the control cost there is actually very small. It's what's that? 400 million is the control cost. The rest is from the loss of markets. And the price of your product absolutely plummeting. And I've got a graph about that in a moment. So as I say, the cost of many emergency animal diseases is actually in the market loss. It's not in the control itself. Because the minute we have to declare to the World Organisation for Animal Health that we now have a diagnosis of foot and mouth disease or lumpy skin disease or whatever else it is, then all our trading partners put up the barriers. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's where the cost comes in. Meat unable to be exported has to be dumped onto the domestic market. And as you know, most of our beef, most of our lamb is exported. That suddenly comes back onto the domestic market. Nothing wrong with it from a safety point of view, but the price drops, of course. So this is just a graph showing the change in grass-fed beef prices relative to the baseline price under foot and mouth disease scenarios. And so you can see, and now these different coloured bars are different assumptions about the size of the outbreak and how many states are involved and that sort of thing. So these are the more, these are the larger sort of outbreaks, along the lines of the type experienced in the United Kingdom. And so you can see the change in grass-fed beef price in that first year is about an 80% drop, and it's not much better in the second year, and sort of gradually improves. But even out after 10 years, the price relative to the baseline price of beef is still, about 20% down on what it used to be. So that's why this is such a scary disease.
Can you explain the different colours?
Well, I don't know the details actually, but so these ones are a large outbreak. It was modelled for Victoria, and these were 3 slightly different variations on that large outbreak. So I think the time to detection and how many properties it affected and stuff like that. But I just want to give you the broad sense of what we're talking about in terms of cost. Now, lumpy skin disease you'll have heard about as well. It affects cattle and water buffalo. This is also a virus. It's a parapox virus. Who's got sheep here? No one. Well, it's actually not the same virus, but a related virus to something called scabby mouth in sheep, which lambs get around their mouth. Yeah, similar sort of virus. It's spread by biting flies, mosquitoes, midges, ticks, also movement of animals and fomites. Now that's just a technical word for things like boots or wheels or whatever else, other objects. We're actually learning more about how this disease is spread because it actually wasn't terribly well understood, but there's been a hell of a lot of study just over the last couple of years to try and understand it. And it may also be spread directly animal to animal, it seems. So lumpy skin disease has really spread a fair bit around the world. It's even been seen in Europe, I think, Greece and Bulgaria. And yeah, again, it's on our doorstep too. It's in Sumatra and Java. Causes a high fever, skin nodules, as you can see there, pretty clear. So you get these sort of crusty scabs, those fall off, and you can sometimes get a sort of a suppurating wound, which is prone to infection. And death. It has a fairly high death rate associated with it. So it's a particular risk to Northern Australia. And if it's in Northern Australia, well then it's in Australia, and then that affects the trade for all of us. And it's not automatic that overseas partners say, oh, well, that's in the Northern Territory or it's Queensland, I'll still buy Victorian cattle. It's in Australia. And you've then got to put the case to say, well, no, it's in a different part, we've compartmentalised it, it hasn't been detected down here. That can take 6 months, 12 months or whatever to organise. So it's still a concern to us down here as well. African swine fever, I realise none of you have pigs, but as I say, this is an important one. A viral disease spread by live or dead pigs. Pork products, again, fomites, objects. And this one survives quite strongly in the environment as well. Causes fever, loss of appetite, diarrhoea, vomiting, death. It's got a very high death rate, I think sometimes approaching 100% in infected pigs. Currently in China and Southeast Asia, including Indonesia and the Philippines. And you might have seen some publicity around detections of ASF in pork products that people have attempted to bring into Australia. And so in 2019, for example, they found virus particles in 202 out of 418 pork samples of pork that were seized at the airport. It's a real worry, isn't it?
Isn't it true though that about that stage there was pork coming legally from, and I mean legally, from somewhere in either China or Asia that was detected in Asian grocery stores in Melbourne, and they had no idea how it got in here?
Yes, I think you're right. I can't remember the detail of that, but I think you're right. Yeah.
It makes the fines that they hand out at the airport for illegal import of all meat products a bit of an ass, a laughing stock really.
Well, you know, I sometimes watch that Border Force program and see the fines they impose, and I think, geez, you might as well slap them with a wet fish. It's appalling. Yeah, it's absolutely terrible. And I read the other day too that I think it was 2020, 21, it was a 2-year period, 40 tonnes of pork was confiscated at the border, 40 tonnes. You can imagine that sort of ratio of the number of them that contain.
Well, that's why when we talked about, probably the closest, Paul and I are the closest ones to Melbourne Airport with livestock. I suspect that we're probably going to be the ones that bear the brunt of something getting out of Melbourne Airport. But we're not supposed to, sort of pull the chain on these blokes and say, Jesus Christ, hit them right over the head, put Melbourne in jail or send them back.
Yeah.
Don't let them into the country, and to have them stand there and say, oh, we did not know, is an insult to all livestock producers in Australia.
Yeah. Yep, agree with you.
Look, Paul Flanagan, just picking up a bit more. I agree wholeheartedly with what Alan says and support it, but I'll also add a bit more. The pork products, to me, are things that perhaps they're coming into the country but being actually sold in specialty type Asian food stores and probably others. But it's not. I understand it's not raw pork, but it's processed pork. It's like might be some sort of pork roll or pork sausages or something like that.
Yes.
But it's coming. It's probably been able to get into the supply chain for a lot of the specialty food stores or little Asian food supermarkets. So what is the government doing to reinforce that? It might be plenty of materials in English language available. Other Asian neighbours aware of it when they're coming into the country? Do they care? And is the penalty structure sufficient enough to deter it? That's a question to take back.
Yeah, look, I don't know if I can answer that question, Paul. I don't work for government, but I certainly do see a lot of effort going into multilingual communications around this sort of stuff, and warning people. In terms of people importing stuff commercially, every product that someone wants to import that's a food stuff has to go through an import risk analysis, and it's a very detailed process. And so you won't get things like salamis and so on, for example, coming from areas that have foot and mouth disease because they're just too high a risk. So look, this is all very carefully done. The risk is the sort of the average traveller who's just coming to Australia for a holiday, who are ignorant about it, don't particularly care about it, and just don't see the problem with bringing in a suitcase full of food. Where things come through official channels, I think, where they're imported, through commercial channels, those are pretty carefully regulated. But as I say, I think that's the risk. Yeah.
I don't want to put the wind up anyone, but I think you're being very generous and only saying about 40 tonne of pork product. My understanding was a few years ago that it was well and truly over 50 tonnes seized at Tullamarine of imported protein product.
Okay.
Not necessarily pork, beef, camel and so forth. And the problem is the people who bring it in, they're supposedly the responsible ones. The simple answer is most of them don't care. And then for Alan and Paul, who are going to live close, or some of us who are a bit further out, when they're travelling home from Tullamarine and their kids turn around and say, geez, Dad, you stink, and they suddenly realise that they've got a bit of bloody salami stuck down their vest pocket or something or other, out the window it goes. And with a bit of luck, that's as far as it goes. But at some stage, if you're going to throw out 40 to 50 tonnes of product. At some stage, it's going to come and bite you on the bum.
Yep.
I'll tell you a bit of a story that happened to us about 10 years ago.
Please do.
About 15 years ago, I suppose it was now. We were running cattle, we weren't running much cropping enterprise on our property, nearly all cattle. Adjacent to a tip that did not have a putrescible licence. At various stages, you could drive past that tip and see hundreds of thousands of crows. Hundreds of thousands, and I mean black. Then we started to look at our troughs. Salami, cheese, chicken, beef.
Right.
But
Been dropped there by the crows.
No, she's gone.
Right, by the crows. Went to the EPA. The EPA accused me of not being a good producer for not checking the troughs every day. Wouldn't listen to anything coming from the tip.
Right.
Just completely wiped the floor with me. Went to the Department of Ag in Victoria, went to the Federal Department of Ag. They were just nonplussed and didn't know what to do.
Okay.
And just said in the end, we don't know what to do. Clean your troughs out, take the cattle out of the paddock.
But stuff like that shouldn't be disposed of at a tip. Where it's...
Not a heap in hell should have been disposed in the tip, but that's the sort of stuff that we have put up with, and the EPA wonder why I've got them on the bloody dartboard, with a target on them. That's the sort of stuff, and I don't forgive them for it. I will never forgive them for it, because they're the ones that let it happen. And the Federal Department of Agriculture, they were as dumb as anything anyway. They couldn't do anything. They just sort of shook their head, took photographs of the bloody bones in the trough and the salami and the cheese.
Right.
And didn't know what to do.
Yeah, okay.
Now, that's a real damning episode that we've had to go through, but we've had other episodes with the Victorian EPA, and really you would not, if they're on fire, you wouldn't put them out.
Right.
I'm pretty brutal about it, but that's our experience.
Yep.
Our experience has been one of complete neglect to the farming community in our area from the EPA.
Yeah, right.
And it is just abysmal what we're putting up with.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be farming there, but no, we're not going to affect you. You know, Minister for Housing, Minister for Planet. No, we're not going to stop your farming. You still farm. But when we try and pull the chain on some of these other idiots in the Department of Ag and EPA, oh, they can't do that. You've been a bit tough. Really? That's where the disease is going to come from. And I did ask the Federal Department of Ag where they were getting rid of their stuff they confiscated at Melbourne Airport.
Yep.
Because there was a time they were getting rid of it at the Sunbury tip.
Right, okay.
And there was no controls over it.
Right.
So this is not rocket science.
Yeah, look, I'm surprised to hear that. I mean, that's you would have thought if anything's got to be disposed of as a biohazard, that stuff would be.
Now they say that it's been incinerated and it's got rid of properly, but
Yeah.
let's go back a few years. So,
Yeah, right.
Do we know whether that's been done? That
From our side of the fence, Scott, you being in the commercial enterprise, it's most unlikely that we're going to get an exotic come in through a commercial producer. All industries have got bad buggers in them, and your industry will have a few in it as well.
Yep.
But it's most unlikely that we're going to import something commercially. It's going to come in from somebody returning overseas,
Yep.
who was contaminated deliberately, irresponsibly, accidentally, and it'll spread probably from within a 30k radius of Tullamarine and then work its way out, or Sydney and work its way out, and it'll get out to the rural areas that way. And I guess at the moment, media is promoting foot and mouth disease, lumpy skin disease, etc. And it's, all of that attention is being focused as if it's going to descend on the southern states through the northern states, and it's not. It's going to come through our airports, more than likely by one would hope it's always going to be accidental or rather than a deliberate act. But the figures you put up there, that are an 70 or $80 billion loss to the Australian economy, pretty good terrorist act could do a bit of damage.
Yeah,
if we go back to the equine influenza outbreak, where did that occur from? Started in Sydney.
It did, yeah. Yeah, that's right, the quarantine.
Horses imported from Japan, broke out of the quarantine centre, was in Western Australia, I think, within about 72 hours.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, that was a commercial one that went bad, but our problem's going to be a meat market, and we're really going to get bitten on the bum when it comes. And don't worry, it's not a matter of, in my opinion, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And we'll get caught.
Yeah, the other thing that, when we're talking about biosecurity, that we want to wave the flag on is public access to private farms.
Yes.
Whether it be camping, whether it be footpaths along the river. None of the bureaucrats that we have anything to do with in the planning area want to acknowledge that there's a risk with that for the farmer. None of them. And I think it's about time that we said to them, stop all this bloody access along rivers in farms where they're actively farming with animals. You've got to stop. You can't go any further with it because you're a vector straight into the farm straight away. Whether the footwear that they've worn while they've been walking around Bali, they decide to go for a walk along the thing, and all of a sudden it's out into the farm.
I'm just going to get a bit controversial here.
Don't worry,
the problem there is that you're only one vote. You're an agriculturalist, and there are 50 votes in Fitzroy who think that...
you're right. Yeah, I'll agree.
That you're being terribly mean, slamming off your rivers and stopping them from going. And your one vote versus their 50 votes. The politicians will go with the 50 votes. So
that's no doubt part of the problem, is that widening rift between urban people and agricultural people.
And
just hardly recognise each other.
It underpins all of these things.
It does,
And that's where the responsibility is going to boil down to. And we're not going to win.
I hear you, Greg. We've got a lot to hear still.
The other thing there
Paul.
to take away, to pick up from Alan and Robert, is along every stream and waterway in Victoria, if not in other states, unless the title is the original title, it's 10 or 15 metres from the water's edge back into your property, which is Crown land. So anybody, any Tom, Dick, Harry or Sally can walk along there, and they could have come back from Timbuktu, or could have come back from Bali, or they could have come back from Indonesia or Borneo, where the contaminated zones or any of these conditions that you've spoken about. So do we, as primary producers, do we have to enact a biosecurity plan in that, like in that grey zone? There's something for councils to sort of also...
that the leased land along that Crown land, which will be a Crown lease, might need different management considerations.
Well, I don't know. I mean, does anybody know what...
I'm sure Scott will get to that, like managing high-risk zones on the...
Well, yes, from a broad perspective,
So the biosecurity really just doesn't mean hanging a sign on your front gate saying this is a biosecurity zone, and then getting the person who wants to come in be responsible for their actions, or the farmer having the ability to enforce the biosecurity. We've got other biosecurity areas too, especially coming in at airports. You'll be looked at and you'll be looked at, and the rest of us can all walk through. Nobody bothers to say to me, "You're a veterinarian, where have you been?" And I might if somebody's asked me, I might say, I've just been trekking happily through Kathmandu. Wonderful.
Yeah.
And nobody would say, oh, Patney wild dogs up there? Oh yeah, saw a couple of angry ones. Or any foot and mouth disease? Oh yeah, saw some.
Well, the other thing is that you've got a mark on a card that you don't have any organic material on your shoes. No one checks. Your sandals can be in your pack. No one's going to check.
Well, again, the shoe contamination problem boils back to the Canadian foot and mouth disease outbreak of the, I think I was born then, 1950s. There was a Canadian foot and mouth disease outbreak associated with a German immigrant farm worker who came in with dirty boots, and that was the cause of the foot and mouth disease outbreak in Canada. And everybody's been concentrating on dirty boots, but they're part of the problem. They're not the be-all and end-all, so that not everybody who comes off a plane from wherever it might be has to scrub and polish their boots. It's scrub and polish your fingernails. Make sure that you're decontaminated before you get here. Have a shower. Doesn't happen. Nobody says, well, it's only ever happened to me once in New Zealand when they said, what are you? And I said, I'm a veterinary surgeon. And you get dragged off the line and pummeled by the New Zealand authorities.
Did you?
I had a son come back from England during the foot and mouth disease outbreak, and he'd helped family over there in foot and mouth disease. And he went up and he said to the authorities, I have been in a foot and mouth disease contaminated area and I'm probably contaminant. And they said, that's all right, no problems, off you go, and waved him through. So when he got home, I was the mean father who locked him in his room, wouldn't let him out for 7 days and made him shower continuously. But, so that biosecurity is not just at our front gate, it's at our points of entry. And if we don't concentrate on who we let in, either into our farms, our front gates, or our states, we're going to get bitten.
Yep.
And that's what the biosecurity is. It's not just that sign. It's
No, a lot more than that. Yeah.
We need to tell our governments how important it is, and they look at us and say, yes, we understand how important it is, but you're only one vote. I've got another 500 down in Fitzroy that we can sway. Deer, we've got a massive problem with deer.
Yep,
and
that's right.
They're going to be an
I'm just
right,
a bit off topic.
Yeah, sorry, I'm pinching your thumb.
No, you're right.
It's all good stuff.
It is good stuff, yeah, yep. All right, I'll continue on. Japanese encephalitis virus, you might have heard something about, was around last year. So it's, I don't think it's strictly considered to be exotic anymore. It affects pigs and horses, and also affects humans, which you may have heard of. Viral disease spread by mosquitoes, and horses and humans are what's called dead-end hosts. So in other words, they can become infected by a mosquito that's got the virus, but then another mosquito won't come along and be able to pick up the virus from either a pig or a human. So they're a dead end. It doesn't go from there any further. You see it in pigs, where it causes stillborn or weak piglets. Also neurological signs sometimes, and sometimes infertility in boars. In horses it's usually pretty mild, but can sometimes cause fever, jaundice, lethargy, neurological signs. And as I say, it's what we would call seasonally endemic. So there's a season when it breaks out, and it's notifiable because of the human risk. Varroa mite's another one, and this is one that affects bees. Have you heard about Varroa mite? Yep. So there's a couple of species. It's a mite and a parasite of European and Asian honeybees. It spreads very quickly with bee-to-bee contact, severely weakens colonies and transmits viruses sometimes. And I think at last count it had been found in hives on 112 premises in New South Wales, and those hives have been destroyed. So this is an ongoing battle. I think mainly New South Wales, come down into Victoria too, I think. And it's only when you start to realise this, you hear about all the beneficial services that bees offer, of course. So once there's a shortage of bees, there's a shortage of pollinators for crops and almonds and all those sorts of things. So again, it's an exotic disease with a very high economic cost. We shouldn't forget endemic diseases either, and biosecurity applies to endemic diseases as much as it does to sort of detecting and keeping out the big nasties like foot and mouth disease. So in sheep, for example, as I mentioned before, lice is a big one, foot rot, drench-resistant worms, ovine brucellosis, so sexually transmitted disease. In cattle, theileriosis, which is transmitted by bush ticks, vibriosis, which is another reproduction disease, so bulls become infected and they pass that on to the females, and pink eye. So there you go, Paul. I've got pink eye in there as an endemic disease. But it is important, yeah. And look, I understand, and again, I'm a bit out of this game for a while, but I understand there are some new strains around which are pretty aggressive and can be carried from one farm to another.
Can someone from the participating councils, or can you, Scott, can you actually come up with a list of that there's special controls, like a vaccine which can be administered about 2 or 3 months before the season comes on?
Yeah, so there is a vaccine.
There is, but they're very targeted to certain subspecies.
Certain strains, yeah, that's right.
Strains.
That's correct. Yep.
Can someone look into
Yeah,
that?
I can add the link to that.
Yeah.
List, yeah.
I'm not sure what you would do to if you were bringing cattle in. I'm not sure what you would do to protect against those newer strains of pink eye, to be honest. But it's something I will look into, Paul. Yeah, I'm not sure what you could do if they weren't showing any signs.
50 years on my property, haven't had it.
And you've never seen it? Yeah.
Never seen it. Last time, about 50 years ago, probably when I was in my mid-teens, when we had it in sheep.
Yeah.
There haven't been since.
This year is particularly bad for pink eye.
Is it?
Right throughout, broad area, not just around here, but northern Victoria, right throughout the state.
Okay.
I think there's a nutritional element as well, but we never really hear much about that.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, my understanding of it is it's a bug that was called Moraxella bovis when I went to uni. Still the same?
Well, it was when I went to uni too. Right. Whether it's the same, I'm not sure.
Carried on the feet of flies.
Yep.
And they wipe their dirty feet all over the front of your cow's eye or your calf's eye. It's generally a disease of the 6 to 18-month-old type beast. So anything then that attracts flies to your cow's eyes is going to you're going to get an increase in the disease. So we had a great spring, lovely long grass, spiky stuff.
Yep.
Calves scratch their eyes, cows scratch their eyes on the long grass. They get watery eyes, accumulation of flies.
Yep.
They wipe their dirty, bloody feet all over the front, and the next thing you've got a nice corneal ulcer, and away you go. And it's easily transmitted, very rapidly spread because it contaminates every fly's foot.
Yep.
So control the flies on your property and keep your grass short. And
sometimes
skinny cattle.
Yeah, and sometimes a fly control treatment on your cattle can reduce the risk.
We've treated for pink eye and flies at the same time.
Have you? Okay. Found that effective, Alan?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, we treat for pink eye and we also give them vitamin A in the form of cod liver oil.
Oh, okay.
My
As an oral drench?
Yeah, and you can actually put it in the eye as well.
Oh, okay.
But I usually put it down their throat and use it as a dual treatment with other...
Do you do it early in the season as a preventative?
I think you could do it as a preventative. And I think there's probably a whole lot that we don't know about that nutritional element that makes an animal more susceptible. So you've got all of these factors that Rob's saying, and maybe a physical injury and so on. But I think that my observation is, for what that's worth, is that there is a nutritional element as well.
Okay.
And we've found that using cod liver oil is beneficial in the treatment.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I'll be a little bit controversial here, and again, if you change the pH of the tear duct of the tear film, then you can effectively control your pink eye.
So, sorry.
So if it's
a little bit off topic again,
Yeah.
which is great, but again, we've got a lot to get through.
I'd love to discuss with you how you do
You
that.
can see there's not many opportunities when the farmers get together and there's this outburst of all this information.
Oh, it's good. It's great. Look, it's really good. Yeah. One thing I do know, Paul, is how you've avoided pink eye for 50 years is, I reckon, a bloody miracle, because most of the farmers I ever worked with certainly had pink eye from time to time, and around this area too.
I reckon you've had it, Paul, and you didn't pick it up early enough.
Could be.
Because we've had it many years. Over the fence.
Right. Look, this is just an illustration of how an endemic disease, can be important, can incur significant economic cost. This is just sheep lice. Can conservatively cost you, 4 to 5 grand per 1,000 sheep, an infestation. Treatment cost of around $1.60 a head. And depending how far advanced it becomes, you can have a loss in fleece value of between $3 and $9. I mean, that varies, with the micron of wool you've got and the extent of the infestation and all those sorts of things. But they're just sort of ballpark figures. And that's something that can be prevented sort of reasonably simply by good biosecurity. So quarantining the animals, thoroughly inspecting them, making sure they're kept separate from the rest of the flock until you're absolutely sure they haven't got lice, and you can save a major headache.
But one of the other things that we've found is that the bloody coppers want to, if they find someone's cattle on the road, they want to go to the nearest gate and open it and put them in.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, yeah, and I've ripped into some coppers for doing that.
Yeah.
And the sergeant at Sunbury said to me, we can put them wherever we want. And I said, well, I will sue you. And he said, I'll go away and find out, come back the next week. And he said, yeah, you're right. He said, we can't do it.
Well, that's good to hear.
We now lock the gates, all of our roadside gates.
Yep.
So we don't finish up with someone else's cattle in with ours.
Yeah.
For a whole lot of reasons, but it's biosecurity.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Look, I worked with farmers who said to their neighbours, if one of my sheep gets into your place, keep it. I don't want it back. For reasons of foot rot, lice, and so on. Yeah, it's good advice. And I do need to say, of course, don't forget weeds. And we've had, you were talking, Alan, about the risk on your place, and we're talking about, slashes and so on. You guys know all these. There's a million of them. And just a reminder then, under the Catchment Land Protection Act, you're supposed to take all reasonable steps to eradicate important weeds, prevent their growth and spread, and prevent the spread and possibly eradication of pest animals as well. That's an obligation. Again, I don't need to tell you that.
But
All right.
Not done anymore.
No.
Scott, in
Yes, Paul.
the Hume City Council region, there is an incentive program for farming community to develop a weed control plans.
Yep.
And it results in subject to council inspection, results in up to a 30% reduction in the rate in the dog.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I don't know whether Nillenbeck or Whittlesea does that.
Hume and Whittlesea all have various weed, pest animal, other support programs. So do reach out to whichever council you're in. There are lots of options.
Okay.
All right, let me talk a bit about what would happen in the case of an emergency animal disease. I just thought you might find this interesting and maybe something that you're less aware of. I mentioned before about the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement, the EADRA. And there's a core principle in that government and affected industries jointly pay for a response. And the split between industry and government depends on the specific disease and how much it's a public health or a sort of an economy-wide type impact, and how much it's a problem for the farmer. So something like rabies, for example, I think is 100% actually government, paid for by government. If there was a response to rabies, that bill is picked up by government. If it's foot and mouth disease, it's split between the affected industries and government, and it's 50-50 or 60-40 or something. I just forget which exactly.
It's actually less government and more producer.
I think it is. Yeah, you might be
I think
right.
at the moment there's $40 million sitting in the fund for foot and mouth disease. It might be in Australia, and if it gets going, the $400 million will be, I think, sourced from the producers.
Yes. And the way it works in practice is government pays up front, but then once all the dust is settled and everything's been fixed, then they say to the industry, okay, you owe us X hundred million, there's a levy that goes onto the growers that would pay back that debt. Yeah. So that's the principle, it's a joint responsibility, and it's not only for paying for a response, but there's also joint responsibilities around preventing the disease in the first place, so taking biosecurity steps and so on. So as I say, there's that EADRA, it's 65 diseases actually in the schedule, sets out formulae for splitting the cost of response, it specifies how decisions are made, so the decisions are made jointly between industry and government. As I say, that's the thing I'm involved with the wool industry, and it also places prevention obligations on the parties. Now, there's then something called OZVET Plan. Have you heard about OZVET Plan? So this is a very detailed set of manuals that tell us how we would respond to fight those 60-odd diseases that are in the schedule. So for foot and mouth disease, there's a foot and mouth disease strategy manual, and it's a pretty long manual. It's about 100 pages, very detailed. The idea is you can pick it up if foot and mouth breaks out, and there's all the information about it. And it says this is exactly how we're going to fight it in case this breaks out.
Steady.
Sorry?
Steady.
Steady? Why?
It's just been revamped in Canberra.
I think it has actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the provision of truck washers in Victoria.
Yes.
Truck washers are not seen as being something that people should be investing in, and mainly the government and the local government. And when you say they should be all laid out, in Victoria they're talking about using the CFA with plastic sheets on the borders with someone picking up the effluent and taking it somewhere else to be treated.
Right.
And they've got no idea how they're going to do it. That's
Okay.
why I say steady.
Okay, well, OZVET Plan is a little higher level than that. There's a whole bunch of standard operating procedures and things that go underneath that, and they may vary between states as well. Yeah. But in terms of the broad, so for example, the first sort of decision that you'll see in an OZVET Plan is, our response will be to stamp this out, to get rid of it. For some others, it will be, if it gets in, then we need to control it, rather than expect that we can eradicate it. So it just depends on the disease, and then it talks about how it would do that and what some of the fallback positions might be. And there's a bunch of other manuals that go with it that aren't about the disease itself, but are about things like decontamination, disinfection, disposal of carcasses, compensation to affected livestock owners, those sorts of things. Look, it's probably not perfect, Alan, but it's I think a damn sight better than just about anything else in the world. In fact, OZVET Plan, it is it's a pretty impressive resource.
And brought up to date often. It's revised, looked at,
Yep.
argued about, put into print,
Yep.
and 2 months later it'll have something else added to it. It's a continuous and ongoing process, depending on the risks involved. So.
Yes, that's right. The other type of manual I should have mentioned, there are enterprise manuals as well that apply to things like abattoirs, even wool facilities now. There's an enterprise manual around that. So how you would handle the management of one of those particular facilities in the case of an outbreak. So let's say we had FMD. What's the response to that? Well, some diseases, as I said, including FMD, may be subject to stamping out. So in other words, we want to eradicate it as quickly as we can. The first step is a national livestock standstill for 72 hours. So everything stops, no movements of animals. As I understand it, trucks by the side of the road are just told to pull over till they're dealt with.
I'm in the Australian Livestock and Rural Transporters Association. What they've allowed them to do is to continue their journey.
Right.
However, there is a grey area on the borders.
Right.
Because it's going interstate. So they're still saying you might be able to, if you're starting and ending a journey in Victoria, you'll be able to end your journey.
Oh, okay. Right.
But if you're going to go across the border, there's probably a stop sign.
Yeah, okay.
So that's what they're saying at the moment, is that's what's probably going to happen. So The old 72-hour standstill, I think, has gone on the last meeting they had in Canberra, which was about 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago.
Okay.
So there's a change in that, but I hear the comment that it's a liquid document and it keeps changing, and that's probably something we've got to be aware of. So.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, thanks for that. The general principle, though, is that everything stops until we know exactly where the disease is, you know, the extent of it, what we've got to deal with. The first thing you've got to do, is, as someone mentioned before around equine influenza, that, you know, before we knew it was in WA, now the first thing is to stop everyone and see where we're at. And then we go through a process where infected or suspect properties are subject to quarantine, people, livestock and things, and we start the process of identifying properties that are infected and starting to slaughter animals where we need to. And so the response is generally, it's an iterative process, so one that we just keep going around, of tracing backwards and forwards. So if we find a property that's been infected, we need to look at where that property may have sold animals somewhere else, or where it's bought animals, you know, so that may have been the source of how that became infected. So that's a trace back, trace forwards animals that were sold from that property. It's just a process of continually doing that until we get ahead of the wave of infection that's being spread. There's culling of infected stock, disinfecting of properties so that they're no longer a source of contagion. And this is where traceability becomes crucial, right? So NLIS, you know, is our National Livestock Identification Scheme. This is where this becomes really important, because we need to know if that animal on that property came from that property, you know, then we need to trace back to that property, and that becomes quarantined, and so on and so forth. Vaccination may actually be used in some cases, and there's increasing talk of using vaccination for foot and mouth disease, for example. So rather than necessarily just slaughtering everything that's infected or suspect, we may actually use vaccination in what's called a sort of a ring control method, where you vaccinate animals in a large ring around where the infection is, and that stops the infection spreading out from that area, if that makes sense. Now, it's not a long-term solution, because animals that have been vaccinated, if we have animals that have been vaccinated, the world still considers us to have foot and mouth disease. So until we slaughter out every animal that's been vaccinated and have shown that there's no more foot and mouth, we're still a pariah internationally. Okay.
Is there a lag time as well to that status, that even after the last animal, does it continue on for a certain amount of time?
Normally about 6 months, I think, under pretty good conditions, yes. But so I've got 6 months on that slide, but this is the point I wanted to make. So government starts discussions with trading partners the minute we've got the diagnosis. And they start trying to reassure them that, for example, there might be parts of the country that are safe to export. Depends on the disease. Foot and mouth will all be blocked out, there's no doubt about it. But they will start, so for example, I'm doing some work with the wool industry around trying to get wool bales moving again. Now, sheep are a susceptible species for FMD. Foot and mouth disease virus can be present in the wool. But we know that if wool is in a bale and it's subjected to particular temperatures, then any virus that's in there will die out over a period of time. And we know what that time-temperature relationship is. So in South Africa, for example, they have a system, because they've had foot and mouth there, they've had a system where wool bales are held, they've got data logger, they've got temperature sensors, they log how long each bale has been there at a particular time, and when they've seen out that particular period, they can then export the wool, because everyone's confident that there's no more virus in that bale. So those discussions start straight away, and in some cases may lead to what they call disease or compartmentalisation, where we say, well, okay, WA doesn't have this disease, so you know it can be sort of hived off from the rest of the nation and continue to export. But that in itself is quite a slow process and can take a long time. But I wanted to make this point, that in reality it's factors other than science that dictate the response of trading partners. Okay, it's not all. There's sometimes a bit of, well, you know, you guys blocked us when we had mad cow. You know, yeah, well, we're getting around to reapproving your exports. You know, there can be a bit of that. So it's certainly not guaranteed that, you know, within 6 months of your last case, you're going to be back into that market. All right, so look, that's just a quick rundown of what it would look like. And I'm sorry, I should go back to this slide because it really, I haven't been in the middle of an EAD response. I've known plenty of colleagues who were in the UK, for example. Any of you who may have met Charles Milne, who was the chief vet here in Victoria, the one before the current one. He headed the FMD response in Scotland, I think, and I've heard him speak about what it was like. And he had employees, young vets who were getting death threats, were getting human faeces mailed to them. He had a couple of suicides among his staff. And this is the thing, it just, and this is a quote from the UK, it just felt like it was a shambles, to be honest. That is what it felt like to me. It was all a reaction to what was happening. There didn't seem to be any plan as to how to get on top of the problem. People talk about how it's confused, there's stuff happening, you know, there's fire piles, all that sort of stuff. It's just chaos. Organised chaos, but chaos nonetheless.
There's a real issue we've got with Western Australia and New South Wales with respect to NIS with sheep. And
yes.
That's one of the, I suppose, the sleeping giants of the industry that no one really realises is that the cattle we have NIS, but we don't have it with the sheep industry in New South Wales or Western Australia.
No. And
if something happens in either of those two states, they won't be able to tell what sheep's gone from where, what's been in the truck before it.
Yep.
There'll be nothing happen, so it's going to be very difficult. Whereas in Victoria, we've got everything, I think, has got an NIS now.
Yes, compulsory now. Yep. Yes, that's quite right. It's a mob-based system for sheep at the moment in most states. But all the states are now moving towards, or certainly looking very hard at, individual animal ID, and I'm all in favour of it.
Yeah. I think the other thing that, from a producer's point of view, I've just gone through sending some cattle away and trying to go through integrity systems to write out an NVD on the computer was almost impossible. It is just terrible what they've done. And I had the occasion to ring them this week and said, send me a book, I can't be bothered. The computer's finished. I don't want to go through that. I've had 2 or 3 goes at the computer. They've made it that difficult now. And the young bloke said to me, oh, it's okay for me. And I said, yeah, you're doing it every day of the week, mate. Try doing it 2 or 3 times a year and remember where your keystrokes went when you did it.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, right. So just for producers, it is real difficult to try and figure out that.
Yeah,
They've changed it in the last 2 months apparently, and it's just terrible.
Yeah, not the first time I've heard that, Alan. Yeah, I know it's.
We should be able to do it better.
Yep, quite agree. Stakes are high. All right, how are we going? We've got about 20 minutes. So I thought now I'd talk about good biosecurity practices. Now I'm forming the view that you guys are probably going to be pretty well on top of these things, but let me sort of step my way through it anyway. And this is based on, we'll ignore that. This is based on a website called farmbiosecurity.com.au, which Animal Health Australia runs, and it was developed with the input from a lot of the industries, and it's as good a framework as any to think about, you know, what are the things that you should be considering when it comes to biosecurity. And as we've said a couple of times, it's not just about a sign on a gate, there's a whole bunch of things. So there are things to think about in terms of farm inputs, people, vehicles and equipment, of course, production practices, feral animals and weeds, farm outputs, and also training, planning and recording. So let's just run through those fairly quickly. So the first one to say, of course, is that anything that comes onto your farm is a potential source of risk. And I know we've talked about that tonight, and you're clearly on top of that. Whether it's feed, whether it's water, whether it's animals, certainly if it's animals or plants, even fertiliser, chemicals, any of those things can potentially be a risk. Right? The risk varies, and it's mostly the animals and plants we're worried about, but feed too, I mean, you know, hay, grain, that sort of stuff can certainly be a risk. So you need to think in terms of everything that comes onto this place, I need to be absolutely sure it's not bringing something in with it. So, some things to do. Buy from a trusted source. You know, whether you're buying feed, whether you're buying animals, whether you're buying seeds, for example. Buy from a trusted source. Insist on a vendor declaration as far as you can. So there are, for example, sheep health statements, and I think there are cattle health statements where you can ask the vendor to declare that the animals you're buying are free from certain diseases. Now, they're not going to be 100% reliable, right? They're not, but they're a legal document and they do at least hold that vendor to account a little bit. But you might also, need to do a bit of your own investigating as well. Record your sources, record where you bought stuff from. Keep a record of it in case you have to go back to them. Inspect the animals, inspect the grain or whatever it is that you're bringing onto the property, just to see, do these animals look as though they've got signs of disease? Can I see any sheep lice, for example? Can I see any evidence of foot rot?
Paul, I think the example, recording with sources, but as far as farm inputs, like buying oaten hay or buying loosened hay,
Yep.
which I bought a bit of in the last few months. And I believe, depending where you buy it from, you can get a certification on that, on the,
Yes.
maybe could be even grain, but baled hay, like compressed baled hay,
Yes.
be it oaten hay, loosened hay, or just plain grass hay.
Yep. No, I think you're probably right, Paul. Yes, there's the Stock Feed Manufacturers Council of Australia, and I think they run a sort of a QA program. Yeah, I'll
Can you get some information?
I'll look at that. Yep. Yeah, I'll look at that.
Sorry, give me your homework.
No, that's all right.
It's all been recorded.
Treat or vaccinate. So for example, the recommendation is if you're bringing in sheep, and there's a risk those sheep are bringing in worms that are resistant to a lot of drenches, and have resistance that you don't have on the property, then you should hit those sheep with every drench possible to maximise the chances of cleaning them out. Okay. If you see lice, you might want to treat those straight away. Some people put their animals through a foot bath while they're bringing them onto the property. And that's not a bad thing for removing some of the more superficial bugs that they might have picked up on a truck. It won't stop you getting necessarily foot rot that might be within the claw of the animal and is not going to be affected by a foot bath. But it's not a bad precaution.
Can I just add in there?
Yes.
When the animals come onto your place, if you don't run them through, if they're sheep and you don't run them through a foot bath, hold them up in your yards, treat them, worm them.
Yep.
Whatever it is that you're going to do as your normal part of animal husbandry. And the moment you've done that, don't just let them out. Hold them up in the yards for another 12, 24 hours before you put them on your paddocks. You've got to empty them out in your yards. Then your yards become contaminated.
Yes.
By the time you put them in your paddock will be clean. Or
Yes,
you're,
very
you're not
good.
introducing anything to the paddock that you're going to have to chase up again in 6
Is
months'
24
time.
hours enough?
In the
A week
yards.
would be better, but you
In
can't
the
do it.
yards,
Yeah.
but
So
yeah,
you can
I'd
hold
say-
them in the yards 12 or 24 hours is probably sufficient.
I'd say the paddock that they go into, you keep them separate from the rest of the flock for at least a spread period in the case of foot rot. So if they're coming in, say if they're coming in the middle of summer, wait until you go through at least some wet conditions, say in autumn, to see whether they've got foot rot spreading between them. And if they're clean shorn and you can't find lice, then you may need to leave them for a few months before it's likely that you'll detect lice, because they're very hard to find in sheep in short wool. So it's a sort of a risk-based judgment, but the longer you can leave them segregated from the rest of your flock or herd, the more chance you've got of finding something dodgy in them that you don't want to spread to the rest of the property. Swill feeding and restricted animal material. Our lady from AgVic, Rihanna, spoke about this. It's illegal to feed swill to pigs, of course, for the reasons we've talked about, because they might be getting, contaminated pork or whatever else. And it's illegal to feed restricted animal material to ruminants so that we're not spreading things like mad cow disease or scrapie or things like that. Those are the TSEs, transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. So it's just important to be aware of those. People, vehicles and equipment. And again, we've talked about this a lot, so I don't need to labour the point, but visitors and workers manage access, manage movement around the farm. You know, I've heard people get up and talk to sheep cockies and say, you know, you guys just let anyone drive in. Often the broker will come for a chat about, you know, what he's going to do about selling your wool clip, and he drives into the front gate and spouse says, oh, such and such is, you know the back paddock, so broker drives off down to the back paddock. None of those movements are controlled. That shouldn't happen. You know, you should have to stop at the gate, ring a number, someone comes to meet you, preferably there's a foot bath, whatever else. Ensure hygiene of people. If you've got staff, train them in biosecurity, and also record the visitors that are coming in. Vehicles, manage access and movement, ensure hygiene, wash down and disinfection as appropriate. Again, record visitors and equipment that you're using. You know, always wash that down. And in some cases even consider dedicated clothing and equipment for high risk areas. Now it depends on the type of enterprise you've got as to whether you'd go to that extreme. But you know, most piggeries that are specific pathogen free, you may have heard of those, they're absolutely scrupulous about this stuff. You shower in and shower out. And you have dedicated sets of clothing that are on the inside and on the outside, and the two don't mix, you know. So no, we don't have to go to that sort of extreme with our extensive properties, but again, it's a sort of a risk-based approach. In terms of production practices, you know, monitor your stock and your crops carefully. Look for signs of diseases that are coming on. I'll talk about it in a moment, but if any concerns that it may be something that's exotic, ring the department, get them to come out and have a look. Dispose of your carcasses and effluent away from stock and water. There you've got to be consistent with regulations, EPA, Alan. Make sure you're not contaminating water sources, that kind of thing. Vaccinate and drench stock. Keep good treatment records. Use and store chemicals according to label directions. Keep fences and yards in good order and store grain appropriately. As I said, surveillance is really important because the sooner you pick up the start of a disease, the better. And that really goes for things like weeds as well. Obviously, the sooner you pick those up and start to deal with them, the better. One of the major determinants of the cost of an outbreak of an emergency animal disease is the time to detection. So when the modelers sit down and they try to work out what an outbreak of foot and mouth disease would cost, they look at how many days was it between the index case arriving and someone picking that up. Because with every day, there's more and more and more virus going out. And this was one of the factors, I think, in the UK outbreak, which first came into pigs. And pigs are the worst for foot and mouth because they put out heaps and heaps of virus particles. They're called magnifiers. And there was a bit of a delay in reporting some signs. Pretty ordinary backyard producer, I think. And so foot and mouth, you know, had spread pretty far and wide by the time they started to tackle it. Well, there you go. By the time vets investigated the first suspected case of FMD in the UK, the virus was already incubating in more than 50 locations. And actually, what they discovered with the UK outbreak was the extent to which animals travel in the UK. And they'd gone to Europe, they'd gone to Wales, Scotland. You know, some animals had been in 3 or 4 locations within a couple of days. And no one really wisened up to that until they had to. We've already discussed this. You guys have raised it yourself, which I'm really glad to hear because it is an important point. As a periurban farmer and someone particularly who's close to the airport, you guys play a really important role in the front line of biosecurity in Victoria. As I said, if you see anything suspicious, ring the EAD or the exotic plant pest hotline. Okay, those numbers are there. If you Google it, really easy to find. But as I say, you can have a copy of these slides. I think there are fridge magnets you can get. You can stick it up on your fridge as well. But if you're in any doubt, you'll never be ridiculed for calling out one of the department vets. You know, they'll be out very quick smart to have a look. No one wants to be the person who's mentioned in the Royal Commission that is held to try and find out why the hell we got foot and mouth disease and why the hell it got so bad. No one wants to be that vet or that farmer. Feral animals and weeds are important, of course. So develop a control program for wild and feral animal access. Maintain good fences, dispose of carcasses. With weeds, it's important to get to know your local species. Act quickly to control anything unusual. Again, ensure people, vehicle and equipment hygiene that might be carrying seeds of undesirable weeds. And carefully manage introduced animals and plant matter. Because animals you introduce can bring in weeds, of course, in their hooves and in their fleeces and things like that. Farm output, so moving animals on and off the property. Of course, you have a responsibility to try and prevent the diseases you've got from going elsewhere as well. So ensure animals are fit to load for a start. Alan will know all about that. Supply vendor decks and health statements to your buyers saying this is what I don't have, or I have or don't have on my property. It's also important to remember about isolating stock who are returning from shows, and sometimes people forget about that too. That can be a real risk for people who are in the stud sector. And again, moving plants and plant products off the property, same sort of precautions apply. And then, of course, there's all the paperwork and the thinking about this. Develop a biosecurity plan. I notice there are some templates up the back. On that farmbiosecurity.com.au website, there are templates as well. In fact, I think you can punch in, I'm a sheep producer, and it generates you a sort of a specific plan around sheep production, or I've got sheep and cattle, or whatever it is. Really important to ensure everyone is trained in recognition and understanding of disease, pests and weeds, and to have that knowledge that biosecurity is important. Contractors, we've done that to death tonight, haven't we? Notify contractors. And that's been a really interesting discussion actually for me to hear that, because it's clear we're going to have to get things changing around access agreements of contractors to people's properties. And I actually don't think it's Department of Ag, I think it's Department of Planning that you probably need to talk to.
What you've heard tonight, and there's a few of us have been pretty vocal on a range of things, including what's up there now. Is this surprising to you, or is it a bit of an eye-opener, or was it sort of you wanted to hear this type of thing anyway?
No, look, it probably wasn't surprising, Paul. I mean, it was something I hadn't thought much about, but probably should have. We're fighting up where I am at the moment, which is Kingston, north of Ballarat. We're fighting OZVET and AEMO, who are proposing to bring bloody great 500 kilovolt towers through our prime agricultural country. And I must admit, I haven't stopped to think that there's all that biosecurity risk from contractors there going into different paddocks. We never think about that, but it's very real. It's a very real problem.
I mean, this potentially, based on what you've seen tonight, this could be, if it can be pushed right back into Department of Ag, this sort of thing could be rolled out on a greater scale throughout Victoria.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, there's only one of you. There might be a couple of others who could do equivalent in other areas too. You only have certain arms and legs.
Yeah. As I say, I think it might be an issue that needs to be raised with the Department of Planning, because I'm not sure who it is that issues the access permits for these workers to get onto people's properties. But I'll make some inquiries and see if I can find out.
Again, can I interrupt in terms of looking at the Department of Ag? I think you need to think of the Department of Agriculture and their officers and veterinarians as being a bit like the CFA. If you can get them on the day of the fire, you're lucky. And if you can get Department of Agriculture when you need them, you're lucky. So you need to, one, really rely on yourself first up, and secondly, see if you can find yourself a large animal veterinarian who will attend to you. And I think that's going to be fairly difficult.
Yeah, sorry, Robert, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing, literally last couple of days here in Victoria, it seems like the state government deficit has blown out to smithereens, and there's discussion happening, well, not confirmed, that the state government bureaucracy will probably, the staffing will be reduced by 10% across the board.
I can tell you, Paul, that they're employing a lot of people at the moment in EAD Response. They've put on a heck of a lot of staff recently, and I think all the states have done that. So I think that's probably one area you don't need to be too concerned about. What is a bigger concern, I think, is a nationwide shortage of vets, and I think departments are trying to recruit people and can't get them, and a lot of vet practices are trying to recruit them and can't get
Well,
them.
there's not so much a shortage of veterinarians. There's a massive number of veterinarians. The trouble is you can't get them to go into large animal practice.
Exactly.
But small animal practice is saying the same. I've heard stories from a lot.
Yeah, well, different argument. But you can't get large animal people anymore. And,
No. No, that's right.
Luck of the draw.
Yeah.
So you really rely on yourselves. Don't think that the Department of Agriculture is going to ride over the hill like a knight in white armour to save your lives.
No, that's right. That's right. That's right.
It's not going to happen.
That's why it's really important, I think, for farmers to be on top of this stuff. And that's why I think it's a pity we've only got, 7 people in the room. Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's really very disappointing that we haven't got a room full of people here tonight. But just picking up on a couple of comments that Rob made, and just generally a comment that comes out of all of this discussion for me tonight is that no man is an island. So we can be doing everything that we need to do, but we are dependent on the customs people at the airport to do the right thing. We're dependent on the public to do the right thing. But something else that I wanted to touch on, which is sort of closer to home and very real for some of us, and you mentioned feral animals, the movement of Samba deer. So Nillumbik would be dealing with it. We're certainly dealing with it in Whittlesea. The problem for us, joining on a commercial farm that adjoins Crown land, the problem's coming from the Crown land.
Yeah.
So there's more that needs to be done. So, we can employ more EAD people, but we have to try and nip it in the bud and deal with some of these problems so that they're not there as the vectors to carry it through our farms. So it's a whole lot of things that need to come together, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It's a whole
absolutely.
lot of collective forces to get these things sorted and have some degree of confidence in it.
It's a problem.
Judy, as you just said, is there's only 7 of us here or something.
Yeah.
Is that we don't represent a big percentage of the population. The agricultural sector is minute compared to inner city peoples. And we've got a deer problem, but you can't do anything about deer because when you knock off a deer, you're shooting Bambi's mum.
Yeah, that's right. Can't cull wild brumbies because they're
you can't
man
do
from
that,
Snowy River. I know. It's getting harder and harder to have those discussions.
Yes.
And I think it will be harder and harder too to mount a response to FMD like they did in the UK too. I think I'm not sure how well the public would stand for bloody big funeral pyres. Well, it's just those things are much more closely watched now.
Yeah.
I don't know how we'd go with a shoot and control method of positive testing. If you get a positive test and you say shoot it, well, you're going to have 100 people there saying you can't do that.
Yep. Yeah, it's true.
I have a different view to that. I think that
We'll shoot them first.
No. The farmers are probably the ones that are going to be the ones that protest the most, and the ones in Melbourne couldn't give a shit.
Yep.
That's the bottom line.
Okay.
It's a really looking at the psychology of this and thinking back to the last 2 years and the pandemic and the fear factor that we saw amongst the public and the reaction in supermarkets and shopping centres with people thinking that they were going to go hungry. I think that what I find really sad about this, and having campaigned and been involved with the BFF and, 5th generation farmer, and when I look at the generations before me, we've all been saying the same thing over and over again, but it's getting worse and worse. That and you touched on it, Scott. The divide between urban and rural is massive and getting greater. And until we can grab hold of this and do something about it, We have got a massive problem in this country. And I see it worse here than other countries that I've travelled to.
Oh, do you? Yeah.
I've been in the most pristine Cotswold village in the UK, and you see the pig muck truck drive through and it stinks to high heaven, and people just say, oh, there it goes. No one takes any notice of it. If it was here, they'd be ringing the EPA and complaining about it straight away. You know, the whole right to farm issue for Australian farmers is much more challenging than I think it is in a lot of countries. And the conclusion that I draw from it is that in a lot of those other countries, they've gone hungry in wartime. And Australians have been pretty fortunate. We've gone through tough times. It's been different. And so people just take farmers for granted and think it's always going to be there.
Yeah, you may well be right. Yeah, it's certainly a problem.
Well, there's a sign up there that said we had an OZVET plan, and we have that for, last time I did my counted, I had 30 or 40 different OZVET plans sitting on my shelf, and you're trying to bring them up to date. The interesting thing that for humans there was no COVID plan.
No, that's right. That's right.
So we got COVID and everybody said, shit, what do we do?
Yeah, that's
and
right.
They didn't know.
Yeah.
But we at least have got plans in order. They may not be fantastic and they may not be, but they're as up to date as we can make them.
Yep.
And basically right from word go, they're funded, and it's spelt out, as you've said earlier, for each disease there is which organisation will be responsible for what and what their cost effectiveness will be.
Yep.
And it's labelled, and so we've got a plan. The only thing is we hope it'll work, and we're not going to know it'll work until such stage as it gets tested.
Yep.
And I hope to God by the time I'm gone, I don't see it.
Too.
I don't want to
look,
see
I
it
honestly think we're as well organised as we could be. And they've invested in developing people and getting them involved in overseas responses and things like that too. So,
I think we're only 10 minutes out of date.
Yeah, true. So just finally, and again, I'll give you a copy of these slides so you can follow these links if you like. First one to say is that Agriculture Victoria have some online courses in biosecurity now. So they're pretty short, they're only about 15 minutes each. There's ones on livestock standstill, foot and mouth and lumpy skin disease awareness, farm biosecurity and various other topics. So they're at that link if you're interested in doing that. Hopefully they line up with what I've told you, or we're in a bit of strife. If in doubt, believe them rather than me, I think. As I said, prepare a biosecurity plan, and there's a few different links there. So that farm biosecurity site is very good, the one at the top. Grain producers also have a place where you can go and prepare a biosecurity plan, so there's a link there. And AgVic also have a number of those on their site. There's also a couple of resources around the broader concept of business continuity if you were tied up in the middle of an EAD outbreak. So if you follow that link, you'll also find those couple of guidance documents which might be useful. We'll give that a miss, and that's the end. So thanks for listening. Feel free to drop me an email or give me a ring if you want to discuss anything further, or I think something I said was absolute BS. By all means, let me know.
Thanks.
Yeah.